This episode of PediaCast is brought to you by the Sports Medicine Program at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Everyone, and welcome once again to PediaCast. It is a pediatric podcast for moms and dads. This is Dr. Mike coming to you from the campus of Nationwide Children's Hospital. We're in Columbus, Ohio. It's episode 566. We're calling this one Heat-Related Problems in Student Athletes. I want to welcome all of you to the program. So fall sports are ready for action with training and conditioning and practicing and playing well underway. But the summer heat is still with us in many areas of the country, which could spell trouble for student athletes as we think about hydration and heat exhaustion and heat stroke, all of those things. And I'm sure that these thoughts have crossed your mind as well, especially if you have a student athlete at home and a heat wave has taken shape in your neck of the woods. We want our young athletes to perform their best, of course, but we also want to keep them safe in the summer heat. So we're going to talk about ways to prevent overheating during sports participation, and we'll discuss the concept of an emergency action plan, or EAP, so that student athletes and coaches and athletic trainers and parents have an idea of exactly what to do when the temperature and humidity are high and how to help if trouble begins. In our usual PediaCast fashion, we have a handful of experts here to help us out. Dr. Jonathan Napolitano is a sports medicine physician at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Imber is also with sports medicine. She's a certified athletic trainer at Nationwide Children's. And we have a co-host leading the conversation this week. It's Eric Leighton. He is a certified athletic trainer at Nationwide Children's. Don't forget, the information presented in our podcast is for general educational purposes only. We do not diagnose medical conditions or formulate treatment plans for specific individuals. If you're concerned about your child's health, be sure to call your healthcare provider. Also, your use of this audio program is subject to the PediaCast Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at PediaCast.org. Let's take a quick break. We'll get our experts settled into the studio, and then we will be back to talk about heat-related problems in student athletes. It's coming up right after this. Dr. Jonathan Napolitano is a sports medicine physician at Nationwide Children's Hospital and an assistant professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at The Ohio State University College of Medicine. He also serves as director of our hospital's adaptive sports medicine program, and he serves as the team physician for Reynoldsburg High School here in Central Ohio. Imber is a certified athletic trainer, also with sports medicine at Nationwide Children's, and she serves the student athletes in the West Jefferson School District. They both have a passion for keeping student athletes safe in hot weather and creating an emergency action plan for when athletes become overheated. More on that shortly. But first, let's offer a warm PediaCast welcome to Dr. Jonathan Napolitano and Imber. Thank you both so much for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Mike. It's a pleasure to be back.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yes, we are very excited to chat with you today. Eric Leighton is also in the house. He, too, is a certified athletic trainer and the functional rehab leader for sports medicine at Nationwide Children's. He's going to lead the conversation today, so let's also welcome him to the program. Eric, thanks for all your work putting this episode together.
Thank you, Dr. Mike, and thank you so much for allowing us to come to the studio and talk on these subjects.
Absolutely. We are so glad to have you. And with that, I'll hand the reins over to you, and we will talk about heat emergencies for student athletes.
Thanks, Dr. Mike. Yeah, so heat illness, heat injuries, and EAPs. And as Dr. Mike said, emergency action plans, as we call them out in the field, out on the sports fields, or just where anybody's participating. As we get ready to head into fall sports, we have to remember in many parts of the world, it stays pretty hot for quite a while. And of course, with fall sports around here, starting in August, we could still wind up in the heat, well into the first month or more of competition, sometimes well into September. And so because of that, there's just certain heat-related issues that we have to be aware of and prepare for, whether it's our young athletes or really anyone being physically active out in the weather, out in the elements. So as we look at some of those, so Annie, I'm going to go to you for the first one here. What are some of the more minor, should we say, heat issues that we can run into with sports, for instance?
Yeah, I would say you always will start off seeing just kids looking a little bit more tired, a little bit more sweaty, and maybe cramping. So heat cramps are kind of the first stage of heat injury, heat illness. You'll usually see cramping. They'll complain of being thirsty or needing an extra water break or just a little fatigued. That would be on the minor side. You could even see a little bit of heat syncope. That could be debated on whether that's minor or moderate. It's not necessarily severe. That would be more feeling a little dizzy, feeling a little lightheaded, maybe getting tunnel vision, fainting. Fainting would be a little bit more moderate into the, you want to make sure it's heat related and not anything else. But yeah, I would say cramps, feeling dizzy, lightheaded, those are kind of our first signs of, okay, we have a heat illness or we have some heat issues going on.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole host of things that can happen, not to mention, like you said, the dehydration, the cramps, but also one of the other ones, just having the right clothing. But even to the point of heat rash, those are things that can obviously mess with your enjoyment of your day or your athletics out there. So going from that, so Dr. Napolitano, I'm going to come to you on this one. We get past those, we get to the ones that we would all consider a bit more serious. So what are those next stages of heat illness that we're concerned about? And what signs should people be looking for, be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Traditionally, this is thought of as a 3 different stages of heat illness, from that cramping to heat exhaustion and heat stroke. However, I don't really consider that first as part of that linear trend, because that can often just be independent, just the cramping and other things. So heat exhaustion is really that dehydration, that fatigue, that weakness, some of those symptoms that Annie was discussing with us. And those are kind of those early indicators or signs. You may start to get some nausea, vomiting, even diarrhea, and you might start to feel dizzy or faint. And those are some pretty good indications that something's going on. Our body's not reacting well to the heat. From a observation standpoint of recognizing someone with those symptoms, it's also some important differentiators is oftentimes those patients will be warm. So they'll have a temperature somewhere between 100.4 and 104. So their temperature, or they're having a fever, but their skin is generally pale and moist, sweaty. But the most important part in differentiating this from the other is that this person's mentally intact. They're making sense. They're having a conversation with you. We flip the switch and get to a much more serious scenario when we reach something we call heat stroke. And this can be a deadly condition and needs to be recognized early on. Those differentiating factors is, instead of that pale, moist skin, we're often seeing warm skin or dry skin. And that largely has to do with the body's inability to keep up. And so the temperature there is going to be greater than 104 is how we diagnose this. And then most notable is this person is confused. That level of awareness is going to be kind of coming in and out. They may be thoroughly confused. I've had patients who have spoken another language out of nowhere. There's this confusion. I'm not sure where I am, what I'm doing. And so that is really a good indication to say, this is very severe. This is not a joking matter, as we all smile and laugh about my reference, but that's a serious condition of heat stroke.
Yeah, definitely. I'm right. There's all kinds of things that even before you get to that level, like you both mentioned, syncope or fainting, obviously the last thing you want to do is pass out while you're trying to stand upright or move. That could cause an injury. I'm going to throw a little bit of an audible here. Of course, we are extremely lucky to be here with Dr. Mike, but Dr. Mike, being an emergency medicine physician, can definitely speak to these as well. So maybe for both Dr. Mike and Dr. Napolitano. So as we talk about some of those heavier heat illness, heat injuries, so we know how powerful the human body is. I mean, it can do amazing things, from, climbing mountains and doing all these crazy things, and typically has a pretty amazing ability to generally self-regulate and keep itself in that stasis in the middle. So what is it that's happening to us when our bodies either go into those cramps or heat exhaustion, or at worst at heat stroke?
Sure, I can start there, and you're correct, Eric, that really is quite amazing. And I think it's even more notable just how amazing it is when we think about how fragile this balance is of when we go into this heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And as I indicated, one of our body's main mechanism for cooling ourselves off is sweating and bringing that blood flow to the surface. It's a way that kind of works like the human air conditioner, where we're bringing that hot blood outside to kind of cool off. And when we overwhelm that tips that scale. Anything that you'd add, Dr. Mike, there for that mechanism?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with blood getting to the muscles and to the brain. So as you had mentioned, the blood sort of getting diverted to the skin. And so lactic acid builds up in our muscles because it doesn't have a chance to get into the bloodstream to get eliminated. And then, the confusion and suddenly speaking a different language is because we're not really getting good blood supply up to our brain because, again, that blood's being diverted. And so that's why it's so important to stay hydrated, because when we drink, that actually becomes blood volume as that water goes into our blood vessels from our intestine. And so, that's the main thing, is really replacing fluids. And then if you're sweating a lot and, you're getting to that point, you probably need electrolytes replaced as well. So sodium, potassium, those kind of things. So that's when, if you're sweating a lot over the course of an hour, or you're starting to have symptoms rather than just water, and most of the time plain water is going to be fine. But if it's really prolonged and you think, you're really losing electrolytes, then a sports beverage with electrolytes in it's going to be a good idea. And then when you go to the emergency department, because maybe you did have syncope or you passed out, then we'll likely put an IV in and get you the fluids and the electrolytes that way.
One other thing I'd add, Eric, there, as far as, as part of my introduction, you introduced my role as a director of adaptive sports medicine program. And that's really of note here, to think of the human body's ability to regulate temperature is kind of taken for granted in most of us. However, those with spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, other things, some of that typical expected adjustment and accommodation of changes in temperature is altered as well. And so those athletes need to be even more aware of changes to their body temperature, because they may not get these early clues that the rest of us get.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. That's something that, as we're going to see here in just a couple more weeks, or in a week or so, the Paralympics coming up. So, of course, these athletes are really just, excelling at what they do and doing the hard work, but they're dealing with another level, dealing with another complication, so to speak. So all of this, comes about, of course, a lot of it is completely due to the weather. If you don't have a different physical difference, the weather can play a huge factor in how we approach that day at practice or a game or anything we're prepping outside, and what we need to be on alert for. So Annie, I'm going to go to you. So the heat index is something that we track daily when anyone's really exerting themselves outside in those warmer months, and sometimes in the other seasons as well. So can you tell us, what is that index, and how does that affect your planning or approach to planning for practice or games?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. For us at the high schools, our gold standard version of heat index would be wet bulb globe thermometry. So we have their wet bulb globe thermometers, and these are specifically designed to give us an overall heat stress indicator. So it takes into account direct sun rays, humidity, wind speed, and ambient temperature to give us an overall stress. That, some days if it's cloudy or windy, but the temperature is high, it's still going to feel a little bit better than when it's sticky, humid, and just no clouds in the sky. So that is our gold standard that we like to use. And so that is accompanied with a chart that kind of shows us, okay, once we get into these higher levels, we need to maybe take back some equipment usage during practice, or we need to have more water breaks, or we need to shorten our practices a little bit. And so we'll have, a yellow zone for caution, orange zone for, okay, we need to take this a bit more seriously. And then, you have your red and your black zones that are, okay, these are terrible conditions. We don't need to be putting our athletes through this today. So that is what our gold standard use would be at the school. Now, we know not all schools have the ability to have those fancy wet bulb globe thermometers. And so heat index is kind of just temperature and humidity, and those relative to each other, again, on a chart, so that as one or the other increases, we have a bigger stress of heat outside. So this can be useful for maybe our coaches who are there during the summer if an athletic trainer is not there or they don't have a wet bulb globe thermometer. You can use a basic heat index chart to kind of figure out, okay, today we're in a little bit more of a heat stress situation. So let's be cautious, more water breaks. But yeah, so those two are the things that we love to use the most. And it just takes communication between the athletic trainer, the coaches, the admin, whoever is being involved in this process so that you can communicate earlier on in the day, maybe, hey, it's going to be pretty hot and humid out later. Let's have a plan in case we do have to take off our shoulder pad during practice, or in case we do have to practice without helmets, or we need, we can only practice for an hour. So I think that helps a lot too. As my job as the athletic trainer coming to a coach in the middle of practice saying, hey, all of a sudden you need to take all your equipment off, and they weren't prepared for that. So preparation is key, talking about it early on. Those are the main things that we use to kind of determine how stressful the heat will be for that day.
Yeah, definitely. I remember, in my days, back out in the field in the high school when I worked there for myself, and also as an EMT before that, as you mentioned, taking off the equipment. The more of the football equipment, as an example, we'll use, it's all plastic. It's all plastic and padding and stuff like that. And of course, the more of that armor the kids wear, the more sweat they're keeping in, and it just stays on the skin. So we become kind of amateur weather scientists out in the field because we're looking for all kinds of things. That wet bulb thermometer that Annie mentioned, we used to have a version called the sling psychrometer. It was two thermometers side by side, and one had like a little sock on it. We would get it wet and literally sling it and spin it through the air for a certain amount of minutes. Depending on how much humidity, how much water vapor is already in the air, well, the other one doesn't cool down as much. So we get that difference. But you notice that. So if you go outside in the summer and, the sweat is just rolling off of you, that's because there is literally so much water pressure already in the air. It's holding back the water that's on your skin. So now it's not evaporating off, like Dr. Napolitano and Dr. Mike mentioned. You're not getting that air conditioner effect where it evaporates, causing that cooling. So yeah, those are huge things that we have to keep looking for.
All right, hey, if I could interrupt just a moment. I had no idea that weather, not predicting, but weather analyzing was so fancy in sports medicine. I had no idea that these things existed.
Oh yeah, we have all kinds of tools. We're looking for the relative humidity, the temperature, this. a lot of us will even have lightning monitors that will keep out with us that will literally, pull up that electrical potential in the air. We can tell if there's one within 30 miles before we even see it.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
We use that same technology. I'm one of the captains of the medical tents at the marathon. We use that same scale of the yellow, the green, yellow, red, and black as far as the safety of the race, again, based on the wet bulb globe temperature. But they even go so far as for a mass event like that, where they have the National Weather Service do a specific report to a small geographic area so that we know exactly what's coming. And it's, as you said, Dr. Mike, a lot of technology and a lot of science into that because we got to keep people safe.
Yeah, information is key. And as Annie said, communication. The more we're on top of this and paying attention, the more we can avoid those unfortunate incidents. So as we know, so we've been talking about the heat. We know what we're doing. We know how we think about it and prep for it, what we do on our end. But so Dr. Napolitano, what's the best way for the kids to prepare themselves for exercise in this type of weather? Right now it's summer here where we're at, and it is hot. So what's the best way for them to prep, to be ready for the season, and hopefully avoid these injuries?
Yeah, great question. Annie touched on some of this, but I think that preparation is so important, right? It's important to go into a workout, a practice, a race day, a game day with a plan, but then also multiple plans and being able to adjust that plan with what the forecast is, what the weather is that day. I think one of the biggest pointers that I need to use when talking to athletes and coaches and parents as well is that, Annie mentioned extra water breaks or something. That's almost too late, right? If you are going out and you're looking at the forecast and you have 2 practices today and it's supposed to be 90 degrees, you should be hydrating the day before, the morning of, before you get out there. You never want to be playing catch up. I think it's also important to think of that nutrition is a huge important part of this too, almost as important as hydration. Whereas if you're running out to an early practice and you haven't fed your body is going to struggle to accommodate and adjust and do those normal healing or accommodation mechanisms to allow those muscles to recover. You're going to fatigue faster if you don't have nutrition there. And then the other thing is just really going through this gradual build-up process. One of the things that the Ohio High School Athletic Association has done is they've instituted what's called an acclimatization period. So instead of just August 1st comes and we got our football team who has been sitting around through the summer and we put on their pads and go for a 2-day practice without anything, there is a week-long process that ahead of that process is that you're gradually getting adjusted to the heat, gradually getting adjusted to activity before we're putting on all that plastic insulation and limiting our ability, because you can't all of a sudden start a season. There's a purpose of a preseason, and to build up to things is really important. And that's really where I think a lot of this cramping comes into. I'm in the school of thought that cramping isn't so much just heat related, but it really is neuromuscular fatigue. I'm seeing that in their, athletes who are the high skill players who are going both directions and are playing an entire game. And so as you're fatiguing, you're running out of that endurance and then you start cramping. So by training and preparing, you're less likely to experience all of these different stages of illness.
Yeah, you're right. Like I said, all that preseason conditioning and fueling yourself, how you fuel before, how you recover. I tell the kids all the time, I said, listen, your workout is not just your workout. It's what you did before it. It's how you recover from it. It's how you rest. And I always have a lot of ridiculous sayings I use for the kids to help them remember things. But you guys all touched on hydration and making sure that we have enough in there. And the blood volume, as you mentioned, Dr. Mike. So I always tell the kids, I said, we need blood, not mud. So if you're all dehydrated and you're pushing sludge around, things aren't going to work real well. So keep it hydrated, but yeah, keep it fed. You've got to rest. You got to take care of your body. So now, hopefully, if we've done all the right things, we've done the stuff on our side, the kids are hopefully, and the parents are taking care and doing what they can, try to avoid these things. In the case, I'm going to go to you, Annie. So in the event we do have a case of heat illness or heat injury, that's when we go to those EAPs, the emergency action plans. So how do we create those? And what's involved in a typical situation, for instance, at the high school?
Yeah, so emergency action plans should be created ideally with your athletic trainer at the high school, your administration at the school, maybe even a school nurse who is there during the day or during times of athletic activities, and your coaches. So emergency action plans kind of cover everything from a broken bone to heat illnesses. Basically, the whole point of this plan is so that in the event of any emergency, we all know what to do. We have our steps lined out. We have our roles lined out. So we know who is going to take care of what, because the last thing we need is a serious emergency situation, especially like exertional heat stroke and people running around trying to figure out who's doing what. We're just wasting time. We're wasting possible treatment time for this athlete. So identifying roles is a huge, huge factor in emergency action planning, as well as practicing those roles and practicing what to do as well. I try to do once a season with each sport team, practicing going through our emergency action plan. And so we'll get the coaches together. We'll maybe get a kid to act like they are having an issue. And we'll run through it just like we would in an emergency situation. And then we'll talk about it afterwards and say, okay, what could we have done better? What went really well? What didn't go well? So this whole process of just emergency action planning is honestly the thing that I think saves the most lives, because we know what we're doing and we're confident in what we're doing so that we're not hesitating, especially when it comes to heat stroke. We need to get them into the tub, cold water immersion tub, as quickly as we can, and to get them treated as quickly as we can. So that would be my version of emergency action planning and how we kind of use that towards heat illnesses.
Yeah, those are hugely important. Should something unfortunately go to this type of level, having, like you said, practicing it, we do the drills. One of the other elements I've been involved in for years when I was at the schools, but before that, I was an EMT. I actually worked in emergency medicine pre-hospital, but I still do a lot of that work around here too. So one of the things that our schools also do is we coordinate these emergency action plans with our local EMS and fire stations, so that we've all talked about it preseason. We know, for instance, okay, Friday night football, if this happens, I need the ambulance to come to this entrance. We also know exactly who has the keys. We don't want to be looking for the keys to a certain gate. But then that might be different in the winter when we're inside for basketball and wrestling. So some of those change. So sometimes you have different emergency action plans, very specific 4 different seasons, depending on which part of the facilities you're using. So that is something that we practice, we drill, we think about. We, like I said, we practice, then we, what went wrong? What can we make better? We make it as tight a process as possible.
I think one thing.
Yeah. And you also have to include, kind of like you said, we have different locations during each season, but we also have different personnel. So for example, Friday night football games, most of us will have a team physician with us. Any other time of the year, that's most likely not going to happen. So I'm sure, Dr. Napolitano, you can speak a little bit more on that on your side of emergency action planning with your school and your athletic trainers, but that can make a huge difference as well.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to add there is just that education. I agree, Annie, it's a great idea to practice this, and so others are aware. I think something that's taken for granted is what can be done and needs to be done in the field, and really that trusting the people in charge, right? Having, even though a team physician is not there, Annie and our other outreach athletic trainers are trained professionals in this. And if you think about an overheating athlete, someone who's in this heat exhaustion or even heat stroke, that person needs to be cooled before anything else is done. And so oftentimes we'll think about, let's call EMS and wait for the ambulance. Waiting is a problem. And then number 2, if that athlete is transported with a temperature of 105, 108, that's time that's wasted, and that's going to continue to stay high. And so really by treating this patient in the field is the best medicine for them. It's maybe a crude analogy, but it's the idea of transporting somebody who doesn't have a pulse without starting CPR first, right? You are going to initiate a treatment plan in the moment. You're putting on an AED, you're doing your CPR before you're transporting somebody because you have a role in saving their lives. Yes, the healthcare system and all that is here for maybe the next stages, but the initial treatment is getting that temperature down as soon as possible. And that's done best at a school, in a gym, wherever you are.
Yeah, for anyone who's ever taken a CPR course, one of the things you learn in your CPR course is chain of life, that early activation of EMS and AED. Getting that defibrillator on somebody who's having a cardiac issue, starting that process early, as Dr. Napolitano mentioned, can definitely increase their chances, increase the likelihood of a positive outcome for all of that. So, Dr. Napolitano, coming back to you. So, we've gotten, unfortunately, to that situation of a heat injury or heat illness. If someone's been affected by one of these injuries, so what can they expect as far as recovery goes from, again, we have the cramps, the heat exhaustion, and then maybe all the way up to the heat stroke. What's the safest way for them to work back to exercise and exertion should we get into that level of issue?
Yeah, great question, Eric. And this is often a point of this that is somewhat overlooked. And I think that's rightfully so, in the fact that we need recognition, prevention, and emergency treatment are really as the priority here. And so that's what's researched and that's what's communicated. But you're right, we know that the benefits of sport far outweigh just a fun activity, right? We want to get somebody back to sport, and we need to do so safely. So I often think of this as a similar return to play process or a protocol like we do with concussion, a similar severe injury and significant injury. So my return to play recommendations for someone with heat exhaustion or rhabdomyolysis, which we haven't really talked about, but it's basically overuse of those muscles that can cause electrolyte abnormalities or other problems with the body, is that we need to gradually work back to this. So step 1 of a concussion protocol is the same as a step 1 here, which is getting these symptoms to resolve, right? We have to no longer be dehydrated. We have to no longer be confused. We have to no longer have that nausea, the vomiting. You got to be able to take normal hydration, take normal nutrition, and you're feeling kind of back to your normal self. When we're back to our normal self, then we can't just jump right back in the deep end, right? We can't just play a game the next day. There needs to be a gradual stepwise progression to really build into that and build up into that. And so a protocol that we've formulated within our sports medicine group is how does that look for these padded sports? Specifically, football is how it's designed, but it's really can be applied to others. And so that gradual return to activity needs to keep the environment and the equipment and everything else involved. So our early stages of that are indoor workouts where it's air conditioned, where it's cool, and you're gradually building up your intensity to kind of get back to that activity, seeing if any of those symptoms come back. Are you having trouble to stay hydrated? Are you having trouble to stay nourished? You're still feeling nauseous. That's a good indication that we're not yet ready for this. The body hasn't rebounded all the way. After we can tolerate some indoor practices, we progress outside, but without those pads. So lighter activity and then gradually building in the intensity of it to get back to those sprints, to get back to that max lifting and other things. And then we add in the pads so that you have your insulation on and your helmets on, where you've really kind of impaired your body's ability to cool itself, and to see if, again, do any of those symptoms come back. Once we can tolerate that, then we build back into normal practices. And then after that would be normal games. So it is pretty regimented as far as how we would go about these return progression through this. But it's done so in a reason to really avoid the things returning. And the last thing that I would add about that is I'm going to focus each of my visits on why. Not so much how do I get you back and recover from this injury, but if you sprained your ankle, why did you sprain your ankle? I'm going to look at the deficits in the muscle. If you had a heat exhaustion, heat illness, heat stroke, why did that happen? And what do we need to do to improve that underlying foundation? What's your conditioning like? What is your body's ability to cool like? What's your hydration plan? What's your nutrition plan? We got to understand the why before we get back to it all.
Yeah, that stepwise progression that you mentioned, Dr. Napolitano, I mean, any injury, whether it's a sprained muscle, an injured joint, or like you said, heat illness, yeah, trying to come back too soon. Another thing. So in rehabilitation up here in the gym, when I do get kids, back to their sport, one thing they always have to remember is like, well, just because you're done doesn't mean you're back to 100%. You still got your conditioning to do. And I always remind them, I said, listen, fine, you're going to start running again. Do not go out and run at the hardest part of the day. Don't go out and try to get in shape and that much heat stress. That's just a double whammy. So I always advise them, I say, start in a cooler in the morning or in the evening, build up to it. Yeah, don't hit yourself with a double whammy of of being tired and being hit with heat. So we have, despite our best efforts, there are things that do happen, obviously, of course. That's why we have plans. That's why we practice them. That's why we train the way we do, between our education in school and continue education, and practicing and drilling and just, being ready for it all. But out of that, of course, have come some great things, and some things have changed, some just recently. So a couple of topics I want to kind of bring up here, kind of go around the horn. Maybe you'll have Dr. Napolitano, Annie, Dr. Mike too. Please join in on these. But a couple of things that have come up recently around here for us in Central Ohio. House Bill 47 that just went through the local government is a big thing that is now helping with AEDs. They're now mandatory in all schools in Ohio, as well as all municipally owned sports and rec areas. So that's a huge thing. If you guys should just touch on that for a second and why that's so important.
Yeah, this has been something that's been in the works for a while, and really excited to hear this finally go through. We mentioned it just kind of in passing as far as that on the field assessment and that early intervention. An AED has repeatedly been proven to increase survival after cardiac events, and also recognition of a true cardiac event. We haven't touched on it, but when we're thinking about heat illness, one of the things that we may notice in severe heat stroke is seizure-like activity. So if we see seizure activity, it could be heat illness, it could be low blood sugar, but it can often be a cardiac event. And so by putting an AED on that athlete early, we get to see it. Now that the fact that this is a law within our state, it's really exciting. And I think I also want to point out the importance of the necessary funding associated with the law, right? It's one thing to demand that everybody have this equipment, but there is more and more opportunities to gain funding to access this equipment, and that it's not only just in the schools and it's in one building, but we know where it is. And as part of that EAP action plan is that you know where that is and who's going to get it and where are we going to bring it. So for us on the sideline of the fall football games, we bring our AED off from the wall in the school office where the building is empty and no one's there, and we have it with us on the sideline, not only for our athletes on the field, but for the parents in the stands and the coaches on the sideline and the doctor covering the team. I want everybody to be comfortable using that AED. So I'm really excited for this bill.
Yeah, I think it's such an important thing. And as you said, the funding is really important as well, because it is one thing to to say, hey, this is an ideal situation to have an AED, but to actually have it there and knowing that there's a way for it to be paid. And there's upkeep as well in terms of replacing pads and making sure that the battery, is working properly. And I tell you, it's something that everybody should know how to do an AED. They're really easy. There's a card inside that tells you exactly what to do, but there's nothing like actually doing it. You know what I mean? Like putting the pads on someone, letting it read. And if you do a CPR class, usually they'll have an AED. And it's just good to have your hands on one of those. You see it at the airport, the shopping malls, wherever you are, you see AEDs these days. But if you don't know how to use it or you're not comfortable using it in an emergency, it's not going to do a lot of good. So it is important to familiarize all of ourselves with those devices.
One thing I'll add to that quickly, Dr. Mike, is I'm not sure who our audience will be today, but don't be scared of it, right? If you've not taken that class, if you've not heard about it, you're opening up a laptop and trying to find out where the power button is and clicking through things. That device is way more complicated. An AED, there's a big power button, and from there, it's going to tell you exactly what to do. So yes, it's important for us to all be certified, but don't be afraid of it and just and let yourself be guided in using it.
Yeah, really good point.
For those of you might be aging myself a little bit, but yeah, you turn it on, it literally starts talking to you like the old school speak and spell. It will literally call out things and tell you what to do. So one of the other things that comes out of, of dealing with these injuries and of course, treating them and learning from them is research. Another great resource for people to look up, and it's a terrific resource for us, of course, in the medical field, is the Corey Stringer Institute. So Corey Stringer, he was a offensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings. And unfortunately, back in August of 2001, he passed away from exertional heat stroke. But after that, his wife, Kelsey, joined up with an expert in heat stroke and heat illness, athletic trainer and PhD Douglas Casa. He's at the University of Connecticut, and the institute went online, came into fruition in April of 2010. So there's a lot of research. They use some of the world's experts, leading experts in exertion and heat stroke and heat illness and just the physicality of what happens, not only for athletes, but also for laborers, for people that are working, doing physical jobs out in the heat and the elements, and our warfighters, our women and men in the military, because again, they are put in these heat stress situations. So a terrific resource for looking these types of things up. And of course, you can also always find more resources. If you go to nationwidechildrens.org and just search heat, you'll find all kinds of articles and blogs and posts and more information on that. So I think this has been a terrific discussion. But at this point, I'm going to throw it back to you, Dr. Mike.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. And Annie and Jonathan, you did fantastic as well. We are going to have a lot of links in the show notes for everyone. We will have a link to, of course, sports medicine at Nationwide Children's Hospital, but also we'll put a link to the Corey Stringer Institute as well, so folks can find that easily. And I do have some of those resources you mentioned in the show notes. So we do have articles from Nationwide Children's on how to help your kids beat the heat, fueling and hydrating before, during, and after exercise. And another one that I love is what is an athletic trainer? They are part of the sports medicine team. We do hear a lot, but the more that I interview and talk and engage with athletic trainers, I'm always surprised at just how much you guys do and all the different things that you're called upon to do. So kudos to you, keeping our kids safe right there on the playing field. So important. So once again, Dr. Jonathan Napolitano with sports medicine and Annie Imber, certified athletic trainer, also with sports medicine at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And our host this week, Eric Leighton, also a certified athletic trainer from Nationwide Children's. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thanks, Dr. Mike.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mike. Really appreciate you let us come hang out in the studio with you.
Are back with just enough time to say thanks once again to all of you for taking time out of your day and making PediaCast a part of it. Really do appreciate that. Also, thank you to our guests this week, Dr. Jonathan Napolitano, sports medicine physician at Nationwide Children's, Annie Imber, certified athletic trainer, and Eric Leighton, also a certified athletic trainer both from Nationwide Children's Hospital. Don't forget, you can find us wherever podcasts are found. We're in the Apple and Google podcast apps, iHeartRadio, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon Music, YouTube, and most other podcast apps for iOS and Android. Our landing site is PediaCast.org. You'll find our entire archive of past programs there, 566 of them to be exact. Also, show notes for each of the episodes, our terms of use agreement, and that handy contact page if you would like to suggest a future topic for the program. Don't forget, reviews are helpful wherever you get your podcasts. We always appreciate when you share your thoughts about the show. And we love connecting with you on social media. You'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Twitter or X. Simply search for PediaCast. Also, don't forget about our sibling podcast. That's PediaCast CME. The CME stands for Continuing Medical Education. It's similar to this program. We do turn the science up a couple notches and offer free continuing medical education credit for those who listen. And it's Category 1 credit. And since Nationwide Children's is jointly accredited by many professional organizations, including those for doctors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, social workers, and dentists. So because we are accredited by all of them, we're able to offer the exact credits you need to fulfill your state's continuing medical education requirements. Shows and details are available at the landing site for that program, PediaCastCME.org. You can also listen wherever podcasts are found. Simply search for PediaCast CME. Thanks again for stopping by, and until next time, this is Dr. Mike saying stay safe, stay healthy, and stay involved with your kids. So long, everybody.